Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin today's program momentarily.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Schweitzer, and I serve as Director of AJC Dallas. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn more about Israel's fourth election in 2 years. I'd also like to thank our good friends at SMU's Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs for co-sponsoring today's program, and a very special thank you to my colleague, AJC Project Interchange Director Nisha Abkarian, for moderating the Q&A segment of today's session. We're so happy to have so many Project Interchange alumni and supporters, friends of AJC Dallas, and faculty and students of Southern Methodist University at today's briefing. It's now my pleasure to introduce AJC Project Interchange alumna Luisa Del Rosal, Executive Director of the John Goodwin Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs at Southern Methodist University.
Thank you so much, my friend. Thank you, Joel. It is really a pleasure to be able to be a partner to the AJC Dallas at the Tower Center. We're a research center at Southern Methodist University. We believe to be a marketplace of ideas. So we want to bring these thought-provoking discussions to the general public and to our students and faculty. So it's a real kind of treat to find like-minded institutions that want to bring these conversations forward. I'm also incredibly proud to be a Project Interchange alum. So I had the privilege of traveling to Israel, and I always say it was a life-changing experience. And so I thank them for that opportunity and the opportunity to continue to give millions of people around the world to come and understand and look at the dynamic in Israel. So it's great, really proud to represent both the Tower Center today and AJC Project Interchange program. Today's program features one of our talented professors, Shahin Berenji, in a conversation with AJC's Avital Leibovich. Shahin Berenji is a Colin Powell postdoctoral teaching fellow at SMU. We're very proud to have him in our Tower Center family. He received his PhD in political science from UCLA. His latest publication, Sadat and the Road to Jerusalem, Bold Gestures and Risk Acceptance in the Search for Peace, appeared in the International Security in the summer of 2020. He's incredible, and the students love him, by the way. So you're in for a treat and a discussion. Lieutenant Colonel retired Avital Leibovich is a director of AJC Jerusalem. Her distinguished career spans over 22 years in a wide range of senior media and public relations positions within the Israeli Defense Forces. Audience is really important, and reminder that this is an active conversation. Please do send us your questions through the Q&A function. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time to hear from you all. So it's my pleasure to pass the baton to Shahin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special discussion on Israel's election. On March 23rd, Israelis went to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years, something that's unprecedented in the history of the country. And once again, the results were inconclusive. We have a deadlock with no one party with a clear path to forming and assembling a governing coalition or a coalition government. So it's a little complicated right now in Israel, and I think even as we're speaking, as this meeting is ongoing, discussions are taking place behind closed doors between the heads of the different parties over how they can get to 61 votes in the Knesset to assemble a government. Avital, how did we get here? Why did Israel have its fourth elections in 2 years?
Well, this is, I think, the only simple answer I can give you throughout our discussion today. Basically, the government was dispersed because of the budget issues. The two, I would say, partnering parties, which is Netanyahu's party Likud and Benny Gantz's party Blue and White, were supposed to agree on issues regarding the budget, the state's budget, and due to some major disagreements, they reached a deadline in which, if they pass that deadline, and the budget has not been approved, then the government is dispersed. So this is what brought us to the fourth elections. It's a pretty short and concise answer, but I think the bigger question we need to ask is what is going on here in the political system in Israel, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay. Who, in your view, were the winners and losers? Because you look at the election results, and it's not all too clear from looking who some of the winners were. So who, in your opinion, were the winners and losers here?
So look, I think that if I want to look at it poetically or academically, I would say that Israeli democracy, which we have, as you know, as you see now, very vibrant democracy, maybe that's the winner. But the Israeli people are actually the one who lost, because at the end of the day, the cost of each election is about 4 billion shekels. The fact that there is no budget, so the country is running on the budget of 2019, actually means that a lot of projects are on hold. So this, of course, is not a healthy situation to be in for such a long time. And 2 years in this region is a very, very long time. I can tell you that the one stable thing in the Israeli politics are the ultra-Orthodox parties. They're the most stable. They have the same number of voters more or less every year. They have directions from their spiritual leaders, rabbis, who to vote for. And therefore, if I have to bet on one thing in these elections or in every elections, it would be the ultra-Orthodox parties, which almost every election receive between 15 and 16 seats, something like that. So I wouldn't categorize them as winners or losers, but as stable parties. Now, the Blue and White Party has crashed, obviously, from a big kind of explosion number of seats, just last elections, 30-something seats to 8 seats now. Likud also, by the way, if you look at the Likud, it is true that it is still the biggest party in Israel. But if you look a bit from a strategic perspective, and you look at the last decade, you can see that these numbers that 10 years ago were around 40 seats are now declining to 30 seats. And you ask yourself, wait, what is going on? I mean, we had here a very successful year in Israel in terms of the corona. As you know, a lot of Israelis have been vaccinated already twice. We're talking about vaccinating 12 to 16-year-olds next month. We had the Abraham Accords, so signed a lot of normalization agreements. So from, I would say, stability perspective, the average Israeli who has always voted for the Likud should have probably voted again for the Likud, but yet it's not working. So the Likud has declined in power, Blue and White crashed. And I want to say one more thing about this trend of new parties, because we are seeing something very consistent in Israeli politics. Every new party that was established in order to replace the ruling party failed to do so. And I'm not talking about the last 2 years. I'm talking about Kadima party, which was founded by Shaul Mofaz 15 years ago, and Tzipi Livni then led. The first time it ran, of course, it was exploding with a lot of seats, and then it crashed and disappeared. Today, it's not existent. And then Yesh Atid's party. Again, the first entrance to the politics was something grand, and now it's really sitting on the opposition ever since, more or less, except 2 years almost of sitting in coalition. And Blue and White, the same. So time and time again, we see this trend in politics, which may tell us that the Israeli public is not enough mature to change the ruling party.
So just to follow up on what you said about the Likud, so the Likud support has declined, but if we look at the political landscape, far-right parties, they constitute well over the 61 votes necessary to assemble a governing coalition. And you have these new parties assembled or organized by former Likudniks like Gideon Sa'ar, New Hope, or someone like Naftali Bennett, also on the right side of the political spectrum, his Yamina party, and Avigdor Lieberman, of course, Israel Beitenu. So these parties on the right, what's preventing them from organizing and or coming together to unite to form a right-wing government with Netanyahu? They have worked with him in the past. Their leaders have, in fact, very good relationships, or not good relationships, but they've had a relationship with Netanyahu before. They served in his government. What exactly is preventing a far-right government from coming together, uniting once again?
So I'm not sure that far right would be the best way to describe the current trends in Israeli right-wing politics. There is one far-right party, which is Smotrich's party.
Right.
The others are moderate right, I will call it that way. Bennett's party, Bennett is very pragmatist. He's not anti, for example, LGBT community, and Smotrich is anti-LGBT community. So the only far right, I would say, it's Smotrich's party. Look, at the end of the day, we are talking about a leader here who has been in power for 13 years, Netanyahu. And there are other leaders of parties like Bennett, like Saar, who say, wait a minute, now it's our turn. Now, Israel doesn't have a law which actually limits the number of years of a prime minister. Of course, there were talks about it for many years, but it didn't really mature to legislation. And Bennett thinks that after being Minister of Defense and being Minister of Education and being a leader of a party for many years and a skilled politician, from his perspective, he thinks he's ready to be prime minister. Saar, on the other hand, thinks the same, basically. So each of them, of course, ran separately, thinking that they could sweep the voters off their feet and bring them to the wanted goal. But unlike the elections in the US, where you, as a person voting, you have two choices, one party or the second party, here in the right-wing bloc, you have a lot of parties to choose from. And while you have a lot of parties to choose from, the votes at the end of the day are divided between the different parties. So Likud is still very strong. By the way, Likud party has a very clear-cut ideology, which almost all of its people share. In other parties, you don't see that. And this is actually some kind of a glue which puts this party together. In other parties, you see a mayor who was a mayor all his life, and now he was brought as like an extra power to the party, or someone who was, an academic somewhere. So it's not homogeneous. And the Likud is very much homogeneous. And in that sense, it has a lot of advantages versus the other party. And look, at the end of the day, Israel is a center-right country. It's not going to suddenly turn around and be left or liberal or extreme left or anything of that sort, although we do have extreme left parties. And I don't see that changing. That's one thing we need to keep in mind. The second thing we need to keep in mind, when an Israeli goes to vote for a party, he or she looks at the leader of that party. And they ask themselves whether, one, this person has enough experience to win the next war. And number two, does he have the experience needed for economic growth here in Israel, although our economy is doing quite well. But these are the two main questions the Israelis care about. And here I'm answering my own statement from before. The Israelis don't really care about the dramatic Abraham Accords. I mean, of course, they support it. They will fly there. They have flown there already. They're happy about it, but it's not what drives them to vote for a specific leader.
So do you think the anti-Netanyahu coalition has a path to forming a coalition government? Because they're just a hodgepodge patchwork of parties on the left and the center on the right, and it doesn't seem they have any ideological similarities or any really political vision that they share.
That's a great question, because you would imagine that in an elections campaign, we would hear about some, I don't know, important topics like security and the Palestinian conflict and education and welfare, you know, all of these usual topics which a state is run by. Unfortunately, the campaigns were focused on one thing: how to let Netanyahu go, how to change Netanyahu. This was the entire election campaign. People here in Israel really have election fatigue. By the way, the percentage of voters actually dropped in 3% because of this election fatigue. But you're right, the left wing or we call it the changing camp, the camp who wishes to change Netanyahu, is consisting of left parties, left wing, right wing, center. They don't have a lot in common. And not only that, they need to trust each other's promises in order to rely on them to bring forward that change. They're not homogeneous in their perspective on many, many issues, except security. Usually the issue of security is the issue of consensus here in Israel among all parties, except the Arab parties. But this is the reason why I'm not sure they're able to really reach an agreement, because at the end of the day, most of the leaders of the parties there do want to be the prime minister. So the question is, who will move aside and let the other leader of the party do that? I mean, it's I don't want to say ego, but it is also an ego issue at the end of the day. Bennett, as I said, Bennett thinks he should be the one. Yair Lapid thinks he should be the one. And the question is, who will take the first place here? And I believe we'll know this by Wednesday.
So you mentioned the Arab parties, and I think this is a very interesting issue because I think historically Arab Israeli parties have neither sought to be in an Israeli government or have they been invited into coalition talks or coalition building talks. And for the first time, you have a leader of an Arab party, Mansour Abbas, and his party's United Arab List, or I believe the acronym in Hebrew is RAM.
RAM, yes.
RAM. And he expressed a willingness not just to work with those on the left, but to work with those on the right. So he expressed a willingness to even talk with Netanyahu and perhaps even join some sort of a government headed by Netanyahu, which is unprecedented, really, I think, in Israeli politics. The fact that this type of conversation is happening. And I was wondering if you could just tell us, who is Mansour Abbas and how did he get to this point? Is it political opportunism? Is it just acknowledging that perhaps this is the best way to get the best deal for my party? I mean, what is motivating him in your view? And where do you see this going in terms of the role his party might play in assembling a government?
Look, it's a great question because the Arab angle here in these elections was really fascinating this time around. But I want to give you a perspective of where the Arabs have been in the last 40 years and how their impact actually grew in the Israeli parliament. So in 1981, there were only 5 Arab MKs in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. In 1992, there were already 8. In 1999, there were 13. And in 2020, there were 17. So that's some kind of a record that they reached. Now, traditionally, the Arab parties refused to be a part of what they called a Zionist Jewish party. And therefore, they always preferred not to enter the government. If they were invited, if they were not invited, they just preferred to stay out of the government. And here came a brave leader called Mansour Abbas, who represents a party which, by the way, is not a Zionist party. It's an Islamic party, which means it's quite conservative. It's very much religious. It has ties with Hamas terror group and Muslim Brotherhood as well. For example, today, just to give you a short example of what it means, today there was a prisoner, an Arab terrorist, who was released after serving life sentence in Israeli prison. He murdered a soldier in 1984. He was welcomed in his village with a big party, and one of the people who chose to celebrate this celebration with this murderer was someone from Abbas's party. So you can't say in any way that they are a pro-Zionist kind of party, but he did something brave. He said to himself, I am willing to do something different. The Joint Arab List did not represent me. In other words, since they chose to sit outside of the government, then they never got the capability to really influence, because if you're always in opposition, your capability to influence is always limited. He said, no, I want to be a part of the government. I don't care about them anymore. We are not united in the way we think, in the way we operate, in our ideologies. I want to take care first and foremost of my constituencies. And that means to get budgets, to deal with infrastructure, to deal with crime, because one of the main issues which troubles Arab Israelis is the crime in their villages. And he did something brave. He really decided to leave the party, take a big risk, received 5 seats, and he's not ruling out the possibility to sit with Netanyahu in coalition, because he sees a very distinct goal. Now, here's something interesting. In the past, something like 20 years ago, all the Jewish parties had offices in Arab cities and towns in which they kept in contact with the Arab voters. Approximately 20 years ago, they stopped doing that. I think it was a huge mistake. The Arab population is 21.7% of Israel's society. We live side by side, we live together. There are directors of hospitals, there are lawyers, there are startupists, they're everywhere in Israeli society. And they want a better life for themselves. So I think he did something very smart here. Abbas, it was a mistake of the Jewish parties not to invest enough. By the way, I have a friend who Netanyahu offered to him to be the first ever Minister for Arab Affairs, should he build a coalition. And that guy was not a Likud supporter ever in his life, but they do seem, the thing they have in common, the Arab politicians or activists, they have in common the fact that they see their own people and they really want to take care of their own people and the problems. If you would hear the speeches at the Knesset of the Arab party, the Joint List, the previous party, you would hear a lot of speeches about the Palestinians. You would hear speeches about the situation in Syria, never, by the way, never willing to condemn the murders in Syria, things like that. So it's a new trend. I think it's a great idea, by the way. And again, this is not a Zionist party, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And I hope that this Arab party will be a part of the coalition.
Let's talk about transition to the kind of elephant in the room, which is COVID-19, since that's affected last Israeli election and also this most recent one. So how has COVID affected, in your view, Israeli elections? Did it have an effect, in your view? And I think where does Israel go from here in terms of COVID? I mean, they've done such a good job. I believe most of the population is now vaccinated. I believe Israel is now working to vaccinate the Palestinians, and so especially in the West Bank, from my understanding. So, and that's happening right now. So, if you could update us also on the COVID situation in Israel, that would also be good.
Sure. So yes, from perspective of Netanyahu, of course, having the population here get vaccinated with the 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine was something, of course, he wanted to highlight. And actually, I mean, you can like him or not like him, but he was very successful in this vaccination operation. And it has been published, and he did not deny it, that he called the Pfizer CEO at 3 a.m. Israel time in order really to nag him about sending additional shipments of vaccines. and he succeeded at the end of the day. Most of the population here has been vaccinated. The kids will get vaccines next month, 12 to 16. Palestinians already, some of them, a few thousands already have been vaccinated, and others are still coming to get vaccinated. Our office is in Jerusalem. I traveled today back from Jerusalem home, and I saw the Palestinian workers returning to their homes. So the infection rate is very, very low here. Most of the facilities have been reopened, gyms or culture centers and so on. And additional easings are expected. For example, the Ministry of Health here is discussing not having to wear a mask in open areas. So that's probably going to be the next step, which will be very welcomed here with this heavy summer heat that we always have here. But Netanyahu definitely was the winner on the issue of the vaccines, and I'm sure it helped him in the campaign. The 3% decrease in number of Israeli voters had nothing to do with the pandemic, really. It really had to do with the fatigue and with the fact that Israelis, some of them just don't believe the promises that the politicians give. The fact that Benny Gantz stood and said, I will never sit in a coalition with Netanyahu. And then a month later that changed. This is a situation in which an Israeli tells himself, wait, why should I go and vote again? I mean, whatever they're saying, they're breaking these promises anyway. So overall, I think it was positive for Netanyahu, the entire pandemic, and he keeps on using it, and he used it in all his speeches, in his campaign interviews, and so on. But again, despite of all of this great success, the Likud party is still weakening.
So in terms of Israeli politics and the talks that are ongoing now between the various parties to build that coalition, which group of parties in your view has the best chance to building or a coalition government? Do you think the Never Netanyahu movement or the anti-Netanyahu bloc of parties from the left, center, and right, or the Netanyahu coalition of parties, which includes Likud, I think Shas, United Torah Judaism, those in the like-minded group of parties. Does Netanyahu have an advantage here in potentially leading Israel's next government?
So basically, you are referring to the next step of the elections, after the election. So basically, today was a dramatic day, and it still is a dramatic day because it's not over, although it's almost 9 o'clock at night here. Today, the Israeli president met with the leaders of the different parties and asked them to recommend the leader that they think would be the right one to build a coalition. After meeting with all the heads of the parties, the president by Wednesday, the latest, will gather the information he heard and decide who will be the next party leader. He will ask to build a government of 61 seats at least. We say 61 all the time, by the way, but mind you that should there be a government of 61 seats, the capability of such a government is very limited. It's a very narrow government with very small maneuvering space, and therefore a very short kind of lifespan. So even that is not really an optimistic scenario in any way. Now, at the end of the day, until this point of time, the leaders of the parties, some decided not to recommend anyone, no leader. For example, Gideon Sa'ar, who during his entire campaign went hand in hand with Lapid and Bennett, suddenly didn't recommend Lapid to be the leader for building a government. He just said, I'm not recommending anybody. Bennett recommended himself. So the way it looks now is that Netanyahu has the majority of party leaders who recommend him to form the next government. And then second runner-up is Lapid with 20 recommendations less than Netanyahu. And then Bennett has around 7. So if the president goes according to these numbers, he doesn't have to, by the way. The president needs to recommend the person to form the government who he thinks that person has the biggest chance to succeed in that. But if he goes according to the numbers, then Netanyahu will probably be the one who will have the task of forming the next government. He will receive 28 days for that exactly. If he will fail in 28 days, he can return to the president and ask him for a 14-day extension. Usually the president will provide that 14-day extension. And even after that, if he fails in that, after the extension, then the president will ask another leader of party to try and form a government. And then again, we count 28 days plus 14 days. So before middle of May, we will not have here any kind of stable government whatsoever. It's amazing to see the different arguments between the leaders of the parties. Each one wants to be the first to be prime minister. Even if they do some kind of a rotation agreements, then the question remains, who is the first one? Is Bennett going to be the first one in rotation as a prime minister and then Lapid? Or will Lapid be the first one and then Bennett will be the follow-up prime minister? It still seemed as they not agreed fully. I think the president has a very difficult task here to try and decide who will be the next leader. Personally, the way it looks now, I would not be surprised if we'll see fifth elections, which of course I'm not hoping for, but it is a possibility. If Netanyahu will receive the mandate to build a party, to build a coalition, according to simple math, he will not have 61 seats unless he actually persuades Bennett to sit with him and the Arab party as well. And as we mentioned before, a far-right party, Smotrich party, they're of course against the fact that an Arab party will join the coalition. So I'm not sure how we will solve this kind of internal political conflict. So right now, it seems a very difficult scenario. I'm not even sure it will have some kind of a solution.
So you think it's likely, therefore, that if, given the fluid situation right now in Israel, you think it's likely the country could be headed to fifth elections?
Unfortunately, it's an option which I cannot outrule, because the numbers, if you look at the numbers, at the end of the day, Netanyahu will need a minimum of 61 seats to form the government. Now, who are these 61 seats? So you said rightly so, the ultra-Orthodox parties. And let's talk about the Bennett's party as well. And we can talk about maybe Lieberman's party, which I'm not even sure he will sit there. Gideon Sa'ar said specifically he's not going to be with Netanyahu, but he wants a right-wing government, but he's not going to go with Netanyahu. So who will he go with? And then Ram, the Arab party, which said from day one, I'm not ruling out anybody. I just want to be in a position of influence. So if Netanyahu will be able to convince his own party leaders that Ram is essential to look, one of the issues with Ram, for example, because of their agenda, let's say tomorrow there's an operation, a military operation in Gaza, because rocket fire has been flowing nonstop. Then what will Ram party do? They will never approve such an operation. If they will be a part of the coalition and they will vote, they will never approve on something like that. So it's a problem, it's a concern. But I think that some negotiations could take place and maybe agreements. Again, the far-right party, Smotrich party, is a main obstacle here. And if you will not have the Ram party, I just don't see how he has 61 seats. And
finally, I just wanted to talk about Netanyahu and the indictments against him, because I know this has been in the backdrop of Israeli politics. I imagine that it has to some degree affected his support in Israel. Where is the investigation in Netanyahu headed at this point? Where what's the status on the investigation?
So look, the trial is something that will continue for at least 3 years. There are 300 witnesses in this trial, 300. And just the hearings of the witnesses will take probably a few years. So according to the Israeli law, until you're convicted, you can continue and serve in public positions. I think that those who have supported always Netanyahu don't care about the trial and continue to support him through fire, through good times, through bad times, and they will not budge. Of course, there is a small percentage who actually chose to leave the Likud because of Netanyahu and what he symbolizes. The charges are around fraud and breach of trust on a few cases. One of them has to do with a news website claiming that Netanyahu was actually meddling with the content and trying to control the balance of the website, so it's pro-Netanyahu kind of reporting. There was another issue that had to do with gifts that he received from people. Again, it will take 3 years at least. Supposedly, utopically, Netanyahu will be prime minister, then he could, be prime minister, finish his term, and then the trial will still go on. So it's not a very serious factor in the government stability here. I'll tell you what it is, though. Those who are against Netanyahu because of the trial are very vocal. And in the past year, we've seen in Israel, and again, signs of democracy, the symbol of democracy, we've seen a lot of protests. Even under the corona, according to the law here, you could have the right to protest even with corona, the social distancing and that whole thing. And every Saturday night, we saw groups of people who just went out and demonstrated against Netanyahu in many junctions across the country. But if you add up the numbers, they are not really a true political power. They're usually belonging to the left camp of the political map, and the left camp is pretty weak in numbers compared to the right political map. But they were very vocal, that's for sure. But again, it didn't really make a strong impact on the popularity of Netanyahu. By the way, according to the last polls, when Israelis were asked, who do you think is the best leader who is right to be the prime minister, Netanyahu still gets #1 by far. And he gets 30-something% of support. And then Lapid is around 20%, and then other politicians in 3rd and 4th places are far down. So despite of all of this, he's still the most popular leader here.
Yeah, he's also one of Israel's, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli political history. He passed David Ben-Gurion some time ago, right?
Correct.
That's quite impressive, at least in Israeli politics, given how unpredictable it can be sometimes. Okay, well, this is an interesting discussion. I'm sure members of the audience have questions for you, Avital. So let's go ahead and transition to the Q&A, and I will hand over the program to Nisha Abkarian, and she will be posing the questions to you. And members of the audience, remember, if you have questions for Avital, remember to post your questions in the chat, and they can be addressed to her that way. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Shahin, and thank you, Avital. This is such a fascinating discussion. And as Shahin said, for those who are listening, please put your questions in the bottom of the chat, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. Avital, there's so many topics have been brought up in today's discussions. And I have a couple questions. The first that I want to share with you is from Phil Stern, who's a member of the PI board. If Israel has to go to a fifth election, is there anyone currently outside the political sphere, outside of the bubble of leaders we've talked about today, who could enter politics and you think make a difference in the formation of a government? And I'm going to give another question as well, super interesting, from a PI alumnus from Slovakia, Andrej Matisak, who says, you've mentioned this to some degree, but can you elaborate on how the period of constant elections and the perpetual campaign footing for the country has affected the quality of Israeli democracy? So why don't I start there, and we'll take as many questions as we can get to today.
Okay, so great. The first question, if there is someone else who will go into enter politics here and change the map, it's difficult for me to predict. I know there were some names, for example, that were thrown to the air. For example, one of them was the head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, who's supposed to retire in June. But even when he retires, he needs some sort of a cooling period of time, which means he can't enter immediately to the political arena. So I don't see that really. And also, if you look at the Likud party, the senior members of the Likud party themselves, who are potential heirs for Netanyahu, they say that they will not challenge Netanyahu until he leaves, until he finishes his terms. So I don't see anyone who is right now waiting, warming up outside and waiting to go into the political arena. There are always surprises there, of course, that we can't predict. As for the second question, so obviously the fact that we are running here already 2 years with the same budget means that there is an impact on the quality of lives of in some aspects. So all the, I would say, special programs or special budget, we needed to go to new things, to additional issue, because this is a country that needs to be run. Right. And at the end of the day, you have a lot of challenges here. The only thing I'm secure about is the security issue. There is no harm because there is a stable military, and then there is a clear division between the military and the political realm. So I'm not worried about that. But economy is one of the challenges, although the startup industry here in Israel actually did keep a relatively high level of economy here. In other words, Israel didn't really crash. I think that what we are seeing now, whether we don't like it, but what we are seeing now is the beauty of Israeli democracy. At the end of the day, if you want to be a party and you want to run for elections, you need to cross a certain threshold. And the threshold is 3.25%, which is around 37,000 votes. That's more or less the number. So yeah, many little parties can try and try their luck and enter the political system. As we see, there are quite a few smaller parties who have succeeded to do so. I don't see any real effect or deterioration on the democracy in Israel. On the contrary, we are a young country, but still things are developing. And one of the examples I gave was the number of seats for the Arab politicians, which really increased from 5 in 1981 to 17 in 2020. So acknowledging the fact that a bigger percentage of society is part of democratic values here.
Perfect. Well, so we have some breaking news, which I think you'll be eager to comment on. That is breaking news, just got this. Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid confirms that he has offered Yamina leader Naftali Bennett a deal for a joint government that would see right-wing leader serve as prime minister first, to a point you made earlier, in the rotation. So you don't seem surprised, Avital.
No, I'm not surprised, and it's not dramatic also. You know why? Because Bennett decided to recommend on himself, not on Yair Lapid. despite of this so-called agreement.
Mhm. All right, listen, I wanted to ask a few more things related to the elections and the topics that have come up. And we have a question from Wayne Trimmer here that I think you'll find interesting. After 4 elections in 2 years, Israeli politics remains deadlocked. How do the issues with Iran and the new administration in the US trying to re-enter the JCPOA talks play out with the leaders of parties in Israel? Is this a non-issue with the general voting public in Israel? And then it goes on to say that he thinks in some ways Iran has benefited from the fact that the Israeli elections have not focused very heavily on foreign policy issues in the last 2 years. So I know this is an issue near and dear to your heart, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
So first of all, I'd like to say to Wayne that that's a great question. Look, there are 2 areas of possible friction with the new administration, regardless of who sits in government, by the way, in Israel. The first one, and the less important one, is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which I believe the American administration will not invest a whole lot in, the current administration. But the second one, which is a lot more critical, is the JCPOA, as you mentioned, Wayne, and the issue with Iran. Now here, Israel and the US don't always see eye to eye, but on the security issues, I said before, all the parties in Israel, except the Arab parties, which I'm putting aside for a minute, really have the same consensus regarding Iran, which basically says that Israel would prefer not to engage militarily with Iran, but find some sort of diplomatic solution to the current situation, if there is a possibility to find a solution to a situation based on radical ideology. But this is the preference of all the parties, left or right, center, whatever. I don't think it has really an advantage. The lack of political stability here doesn't have any advantage for Iran. I don't see it that way at all. Because at the end of the day, again, what falls under the security sector is really taken care of in a very good way, which means, as you know, the Minister of Defense says, all options are on the table, whether they're diplomatic, whether they're military, we're ready to do everything it takes. I do hope that the American administration, when coming this week, I think tomorrow, meeting with the 5 other countries and the Iranian representatives, I do hope they consider what Iran has been up to in the last couple of years, when they understand that the JCPOA of 2015 is not the same situation in 2021, and take that into consideration. The sanctions, for example, was something that Israel was a great supporter and believer. This is a non-violent means, but can create pressure. Iran, at the end of the day, from an Israeli perspective, has a very distinctive goal. They want to see Israel non-existent. They don't have a problem with the Jews, by the way. They have a problem with Israel as the land of the Jews. And they have the aspirations to produce nuclear weapons. And I don't see how these aspirations are going anywhere at this point of time. It will be interesting to see whether the current administration is echoing the same policy of the previous administration, not the Trump one, but the President Obama one, because we are in a different era. Just one more thing, we didn't have that in 2015, but one of the changes that happened from 2015 to 2021 was the Iranian aspirations to develop and produce strategic missiles, which are accurate missiles. And this is today, according to the Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, are the number 2 threat, is the number 2 threat. After nuclear capability is the strategic and accurate missile capability. So this also needs to go into the mix of the JCPOA. But again, I would put the Iran topic aside. It has really, that has nothing to do with the political mess that we're in.
Right. So I have a bunch of questions which kind of center on the theme of change. What would it take to bring us to allow the elections to proceed in a way that provides a conclusive and definitive response? The questions range from, are there efforts underway to put a limitation on presidential terms? What suggestions or changes have been made to break this deadlock? What will prevent in the absence of a conclusive fifth election, are there any boundaries in effect legally to simply, continue having elections, a fifth, the sixth, the seventh? Are there any barriers to that outcome? And are there any Israeli politicians who've put forward kind of cogent and compelling alternatives to the current system, whether it's by raising the threshold or what have you?
Yeah, so there are talks already for years on limiting the term of the prime minister. By the way, it's not presidency, it's prime minister. In Israel, the politician is the prime minister and the president is more symbolic kind of role, a role that really unifies the people from within. By the way, here is something interesting. If I just mentioned the president, he is supposed to finish or end his term in July. And one of the ideas that has been floating in the air is, why not Netanyahu? Netanyahu will replace him as the president. In this way, he will be able to retire in a very dignified way and open the possibility to another leader to take over. And maybe that would end the deadlock. Netanyahu said on camera that he is not interested in that position. Whether that promise would hold, that declaration would hold, maybe it held just for that week, I don't know. That was 2 weeks ago when he gave that interview. So that's one option. So despite the fact that there were talks about limiting the term of the prime minister, nothing has been legislated until now. So therefore, there are currently no limitations on that. Another alternative to the election system that we have, no, there isn't one. The threshold, by the way, was already increased in the past. In the past, it was lower than 3%, and it has still been, it was increased to 3.25. I'm not sure it will be very effective if there will be another increase in the threshold, but I don't see that on the table anyway. Unfortunately, there is no limitation on the number of elections that could take place here. So theoretically, hypothetically speaking, there can be a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. We actually were never in this situation. So there wasn't any need to limit a number of elections because it never happened before. The only way to solve this deadlock is for leaders of some of the parties to make concessions. That's the only thing. And since we are talking about politicians and think they want to be the first runners up and not always ready to make concessions, we are still in the deadlock. But there is hope. The president has until Wednesday to pick the leader who will have the best chances to build a coalition. And maybe until then, the leaders of the parties can still discuss and maybe reach some sort of an agreement, and maybe this would have some sort of a positive effect. I have to say, I'm not very optimistic. There is a chance, but the problem is really ideologies here. I mean, Lapid's ideology and Bennett's ideology could not be more further apart. So you ask yourselves, how do they overcome this really very essence of who they are as politicians and then sit together in the same coalition? It's almost not doable from a political perspective.
Avital, we have time for one more question, last one actually, although I'd love to continue the conversation for much longer. And that is that, as you look at we see the front runners, whether from Gidon Sar to Yair Lapid. Can you briefly summarize for us, help us feel a sense of meeting the younger generation in the parties? Do they look like the current leadership of the party? Do you see new trends? And as we look towards the future and how Israeli elections might look in 20 years, does the composition of the younger and emerging crowd give us any reason to expect that elections will look any different 20, 30 years from now, or much the same with different faces?
So you're asking me a question to predict in 20 years, which I don't know what will happen tomorrow morning.
The younger
but
leaders of the parties, do you have a sense?
Yeah, so I do think that demography of the politicians have really shifted in the last couple of years, because again, Israel is a young country and it's modern, and then for it's adapting to its modernism. For example, our Minister of Justice, who is a Likud member, by the way, he is a gay minister who is raising, I think he's raising a child with his husband, partner to life. And we have others as well who are in opposition, but they're also part of the LGBT community. And this is something which is not a secret. And yet they sit with the religious parties in the same parliament, and everybody's living together happily. You can say that in politics. So we do see that. We do see not enough women, by the way. If the current Knesset today will really, go into effect in May, there are 30 women, and this is far from sufficient. So I think there needs to be some improvement, major improvement on that issue. We do see some young leaders. Obviously, when you see young leaders who haven't been through the 6-day war or the 73 war, it's a different concept. But I do want to say one thing. There is some sort of a notion or impression that the Israeli parliament is filled with generals or ex-generals from the military, and they're so successful in politics. When you look at the end of the day at the numbers, there are very few of them who entered the politics, and those who entered usually failed. So it's far from being the hub of ex-military or ex-security officials. There are a lot more entrepreneurs. Nir Barkat, for example, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, was a guy who made an exit in startup. By the way, Barkat was Bennett the same. Bennett also made 2 exits. So a lot of businessmen. In other words, there are different really kinds of politicians from different spheres of society. Definitely, security is not the most popular sector among the politicians. But as I said, we do need to see some improvement on some of the sectors.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about. And I think you gave us a sense of the changes that we will see, just as in reflection of the changes in Israeli society. And certainly no one can fault the Israeli electoral cycle for being less than as innovative and dynamic as its economic leadership and leadership in the COVID inoculation campaigns has been. There's a lot of new ideas, and my goodness, the 2-party system that we have here could probably benefit from, the infusion of new leaders from time to time. But Avital, it's been a delight to hear from you. Shahin, we enjoyed this so much, and thank you, Louisa, for your warm words about Project Interchange. We loved having you, we loved hosting you, and hope to see many of you on the call again in Israel as, God willing, the COVID situation continues to improve. So thank you so much to our honored speaker. And for those who are listening, we'd like to invite you to a special AJC Dallas roundtable discussion, which is taking place this Wednesday, day after tomorrow, with leaders from Dallas's AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community, about the continued rise in anti-Asian hate. And that very important program is co-sponsored with the City of Dallas's Office of Equity and Inclusion. The link is in the chat if you want more details on it. And a second program that we wanted to invite you to, we would love for you all to join us as we celebrate Israel Independence Day with AJC on the 15th of April, and join Project Interchange on the 28th of April for a webinar on energy innovation and renewables in Israel. And again, details are in the links in the chat. And before we go, I am going to turn the program over one last time to the Tower Center's Senior Associate Director, Ray Rafidi. Ray?
Thank you very much, Nisha. And on behalf of the Tower Center, thank you so much, Avital. This was just an absolutely wonderful program. Obviously, with anything related to the Middle East, we could go on for days and still just scratch the surface. So I'm not unaware of the time difference between Dallas and Washington and Israel. So thank you so much for staying up late to be with us and to answer all of our questions. This has been absolutely a treat, and I can't thank you enough for it. When I first approached Joel about doing something on the Israeli elections, which was about 2 months ago, so right before they even took place, he suggested we go straight to the source in Jerusalem, and I couldn't be more pleased. So thank you, Joel, for this, and thank you again, Avital, for what you've done. Just to say a word too about the relationship we've had, or collaboration we've had with AJC over the past couple of years. It's been phenomenal. We started a couple of years ago with, it was a water program. I think they referred to it earlier, where we had to go by Skype because somebody had a death in the family, and it was, we did it. So that was a few years ago. Since then, we've also collaborated on bringing Stephen Cook and Aaron David Miller here to campus and to Dallas with AJC, and also, of course, your program today. So this is a wonderful collaboration. I'm really glad we're doing things together. There's a lot of interest in that part of the world here in the city. And again, thank you so much. So I won't take too much of your time. I know it's late there, so I will bid you a good evening and look forward to seeing you soon. We'll also eagerly anticipate what's going to happen in Israel in the next couple of days, like you guys are there. So with that, again, I bid you a good evening, and everyone else, have a very nice day. Take care.